Morning again. We're going to continue in our with our subject of learning how to speak Christian is what we call this. And basically, what we're trying to do is go through some of the important words in the Bible that perhaps don't come across as clear in their meaning because we live in a different time and social situation is a little different, so not everything immediately translates or hits us as it would have the audiences of the original times. So last week we talked about the word redemption. We said it was like one of the most important words in the Bible because it is really the main subject of the Bible. We talked about the Beit, the father's house, the whole family structure, which was incredibly important, and where that family structure sort of serves as kind of a basis for understanding redemption. And just to kind of quickly review, we defined redemption. We said in Israel's tribal society, redemption was the act of a patriarch who put his own resources on the line to ransom a family member who had been driven to the margins of society by poverty, or who had been seized by an enemy against whom he had no defense, or who found themselves enslaved by the consequences of a faithless life. So that's what we had last week for redemption. The definition came from Sandra Richter's book, The Epic of Eden. So, as we talked about redemption, today we're moving on to covenant, which is another incredibly important concept. And basically the way to think about this is that if redemption is the main theme of the Bible, covenant is the main vehicle through which redemption is applied. Covenants are all over the Bible. They are mentioned in the Bible very frequently. If you want to just do a word count, I think there's like some 300 mentions, but that alone obviously doesn't mean that it's important, but at least it should alert us that there might be something to this. And here is a list of 6 covenants. We're going to go through this list, although it's somewhat of a disputed list. But covenants in the Bible with Adam in the Garden of Eden, with Noah after the flood, with Abraham promising Abraham offspring and land, and with the people of Israel through Moses on Mount Sinai, and with David promising a perpetual royal line. That means he's always going to have a successor on the royal throne, and finally with the elect through Jesus Christ. Now, like I said, this list is somewhat disputed. Some folks would strike out Adam in the Garden of Eden because the word covenant is technically not used in that context. Personally, I fall with the crowd who thinks that you don't really necessarily need to have the word if you have all the conceptual elements there. Like if the elements of the covenant are there, it's not really necessary to have the word itself spelled out. Some folks would actually even extend this list and they would add a few more, like the one with Phinehas. But I'm not sure that those are, these are the most important ones. They sort of connect the entire Bible story. And one of the things that you guys have heard me mention before is dispensational theology and covenant theology. And I had sort of, made it a point that dispensational theology is kind of this boogeyman. Maybe I need to make a little more nuanced of a statement there and say not all dispensational theology is necessarily bad, only like the more extreme versions of it are. So let me explain real quick, like what's the difference. So covenant theology, what it tries to do is it tries to see the unity in the entire Bible. And basically, if you think about it like as a chain, all right, with pearls on it. So kind of it's a thing that connects, and all these covenants are like different pearls. And it sees an organic unity between whatever God has been doing since the Garden of Eden up until this time. So kind of that's the main idea of covenant theology. Dispensational theology kind of comes from a different direction, and it tries to kind of dissect these and separate them and kind of see them as God working 2 different plans, essentially, one for Israel, one for the church. I strongly disagree with that notion. However, like I said, mild dispensationalists are, that's an in-house debate. The more extreme versions of dispensationalism are the ones that are harmful, and I have come across people like this. One of the types is, I don't know if you guys remember the name John Hagee. He used to be a very popular guy. He's not anymore, but he's one of those extreme ones. And one of his ideas or one of his doctrinal positions is that Jews do not need Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ is for the Gentiles only, not for the Jews. He even had a book written about it.
Is he still alive?
I think he is. I haven't heard
his
that
ministry. Did something happen?
Yeah, you don't hear about him anymore. Yeah, he's maybe like 5 years ago or something. I think I've heard.
I used to watch him a few times here and there. My mom watched him.
Okay, all right. He was big on TV. Yeah, he was hugely popular. Yeah, but he had this unhealthy obsession with Israel in some ways. And one of the things he came up with is that Jesus Christ was never the salvation path that was offered to the Jews. So, and when he published that book, even some of his people from his ministry had kind of distanced themselves from him. That was some 10, 15 years ago, maybe.
Wow.
Yeah, so that's one extreme dispensational view. Another one is one that goes into more of like a hyper grace thing where, believe it or not, and I have talked to people like this, I'm not making it up, they believe that everything that Jesus spoke does not pertain to Christians. Christians only should be reading the epistles. What Jesus was talking about is supposedly the kingdom ethics that will only be applied in the millennial kingdom. We talked about the millennial kingdom when we studied the book of Revelation. So everything Jesus said only is going to be for that future time, and the church only needs to be reading basically the Apostle Paul, more or less, and the other epistles.
So some scripture that pretty much directly contradicts
I know.
that.
There's all over the place. All
Like,
over the place.
Yeah.
But these are the people who are so hyper grace that they will say, no, all you need to do is just make a mental assent to God of the Bible, and you don't need to do anything because you're saved by grace. So everything that Jesus was saying about doing things, no, we don't want to go into doing. You don't do anything. You keep on sinning as you will, because you're saved by grace, and then in the millennial kingdom you will be tied back. So those are some bad, like more extreme versions of dispensationalism that kind of get really out there and are very harmful. The more mild ones are really not so bad. They're more like just in theory trying to discern what is the role of Israel and what is the role of the church and how do you see it. But they don't go into this nonsense of Jesus.
Well, they're different because they're Jews, but ultimately everybody needs Jesus.
Right, yeah. So that's to me that's the way I see covenant theology is. Everything is an organic unity. Now, granted, God worked through different administrations or dispensations, if you will. We have this stage with Adam, with Noah, with Abraham, so on and so forth. And yes, things were developing, but it's still one.
Isn't there a scripture that talks about the Gentiles basically becoming Jews because of the grace?
Being grafted, yes. Yeah, grafted in, yes.
I can't think
of you can talk about Romans 11, and you can talk about some of the Old Testament stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. There definitely is. So, anyway, covenants are hugely important. Sorry about this little detour. Covenants are hugely important, and we're going to start with giving one definition. We're going to see actually a couple of different ways we can look at it. So, covenant is an agreement between two parties where one or both of them promise under oath to perform or refrain from certain specified actions. So, it's sort of like a contract, basically. It's sort of like a contract. And covenants could be established on just about any societal level. So it can be between two individuals, like two patriarchs, for example. It can be between tribes. It can be between nations. And between the first example, like Jacob and Laban. Do you guys remember what happened with Jacob and Laban?
Yes, Laban was Rebecca's father, right?
Right.
And he worked for him for 7 years, and then another 7
Yes.
years.
Okay. So yes.
And
So
the other daughter, and
right.
yes, I know.
So that was a covenant of equals, if you will.
Laban broke that.
Well, Laban broke it, right? Yeah.
More than
Laban reneged on it. Yeah, he was a crafty dude. The idea behind it was, let's make a deal. I'm gonna give you this. You're gonna give me. It was a partnership of equals.
That was the spotted cows thing and all that.
Yes. That's a pretty crazy story. Yeah. Good point. All right. So the second example we have, and we're actually maybe even going to read it later, time permitting, is Joshua and the Gibeonites from the book of Joshua 9-10. Does anyone remember what happened there? That one is not as famous of a story, but I think you'll remember it after we're done with this. Oops. All right. So what happened is Joshua. What was Joshua's? What was the theme in the book of Joshua? It is conquering the promised land, right? So the Israelites are coming in. They took down Jericho. They took down the city of Ai, and everyone hears about about their, they have the momentum going, right? All right, so the people of the land are hearing that there are these invaders coming, there's a momentum, and everyone's sort of in a state of panic, naturally. But these Gibeonites are pretty clever. So what they do is they dress themselves up in ragged clothes. They pack some stale bread in their bags. They, rough up their their mules or whatever, camels, to look like they've come from a long way. And they go, and basically they were a city that was only a few miles away. But they made themselves look like as if they came from a long ways away. Right? And they come to Joshua and say, hey, we want to establish a covenant with you. And Joshua falls for it, even though he was told by God not to establish any covenants with the peoples of the land. But these guys, played it good, pulled it off. So they established a covenant with Joshua, and then we'll see what the consequences of that covenant are. So it's a pretty important example. We'll come back to it, but it was a covenant that was created under some false pretenses. So anyway, ancient Middle Easterners, as well as other societies, practiced fictive kinship. This is to explain where this concept of covenant kind of comes from bottom up. So fictive kinship, what's fictive kinship? That's a process by which a person or group creates family-like relationship with persons that they're not related to. All right, so can you give me an example of our modern society creating fictive kinship? Like making kinfolk out of non-kinfolk.
My wife has all kinds of aunts and uncles that there's no... I really have all kinds of aunts and uncles. I come from a huge family. She doesn't. So when we started dating, she started talking about all these aunts and uncles. I'm like, wait a minute, you don't have all.
Those are mine, right?
They're like, she calls them adopted aunts and uncles.
Very good, yeah. So in-laws is one way, and adopted kids, right? You adopt a kid, yeah, it's fictive kinship. Legally, you're related, even though physically or genetically you're not. Okay, so why do we bring this up? Well, remember last week we talked about how important family was in that society, and how everything was viewed through the family dynamics. It was a huge thing. So, for people to extend outside of their family and to create meaningful bonds, they would start creating these covenants where they would, create family-like relationships with other people that they're not related to. So, you could, and then that kind of got principle was taken up, and you could do it between tribes, you can do it between nations. But it's important because they use the language of family in these treaties, as we're gonna see. All right. So there are two types of covenants. The first one is called parity treaty. It's a covenant between equals. All right. So when established internationally, these covenants were used, usually made for the purpose of mutual protection, and the parties would frequently refer to each other as brothers. All right, so that one's pretty simple, right? However, that one's not so important for our study. I mean, we mentioned Jacob and Laban. That was kind of one of those. They come up in the Bible, but they're kind of sporadic. The next one is really the one that's a lot more important for us to understand the whole concept of God's covenant with humanity. And we're going to do some big words here, but we're going to simplify them. So it's called the suzerain vassal treaty. So basically, that's just the covenant between a big guy and a little guy. All right. Suzerain was the sovereign independent party, and the vassal was the smaller, weaker, dependent party. Basically, we encounter the language here in this type of a relationship. We encounter the language of father and son, as well as lord and servant. So very often, the vassal would receive land from the suzerain and would owe him loyalty and financial tribute in exchange for military protection. Naturally, the suzerain could have multiple vassals, and a vassal could have only one overlord. Covenants understood faithfulness, and the Hebrew word was hesed. Hesed, I can't do that sound. In our Bibles, it's variously translated as mercy, love, loving kindness, faithfulness, but it really refers to covenant faithfulness. So, by the way, I failed to, actually, I should have done this as an introduction, so let me back this up real quick. The Hebrew word for covenant is buried. The Greek word was the atheke. And we're bringing Latin in. We don't normally do that, but this is just because it's interesting in why we call our Bibles, divide our Bible into the Old and the New Testament. In Latin, this Greek word was translated as testamentum. Now, does that remind you of anything Bible related? Old Testament, New Testament. All right. So that was sort of not really the best translation because this Greek word apparently can mean both last will and testament and a contract. Like it's a broader word for and when it was translated into Latin, they picked a more narrow meaning that we inherited. So we call our Old Testament and New Testament, we use that word. It comes from Latin. No one's going to change that now. Yes, it is a little inaccurate, but yeah, obviously no one's going to change that. And since Larry just walked in, I'm going to repeat this because I think he's going to find this interesting. So basically, the Latin word for covenant is testamentum. And the reason why we call our Old Testament and New Testament, why we use those words is because of this Latin translation. It's not the best translation, but it's been established, no one's going to change that. But essentially what we're talking about is Old Covenant and New Covenant. That's the meaning behind those
What
words.
is the word testament? I always
Testamentum.
thought it was testifying, like.
Well, yeah, it has to do with that. Yes,
Okay.
it has to do. Yeah, it's related to that as well. But we think of it more as the last will and testament, kind of like something that someone unilaterally does. Like, okay, this is my. You don't think of it as a contract between two parties, but the word covenant really refers more to a contract.
Comes from that.
Yeah.
Just derived from that.
Yeah, and really quickly, again, for your sake, we've just flipped to page 2, but we talked about two types of covenants. One is parity treaty, where we're talking about equals, and the other one that's a lot more important for us is the suzerain vassal treaty. And those are, like I said, those are big sounding words, but basically what we're talking about is a big guy and a little guy. Suzerain is the big guy. He comes in and he lays down the rules, basically. And this was something that was very present in this time in period in history. The area that Israel would inhabit was actually settled by a lot of little city-states. When you read in the Old Testament, like the time of Abraham, and you read about kings, take the word king very loosely. These were guys who were basically, mayors on steroids. It was a city with a little bit of a surrounding country that was like a polity, and this guy was king over that. So we're not talking about anything extravagant. But then later on, as some of these keep consolidating, probably some through covenants, but through conquering would be more commonly. Then we get into these larger kingdoms. We get into the larger kingdoms and empires, and that's where we come across these covenants. So right now, let's talk about Joshua. Let's talk about this thing that happened in Joshua, and we're at 20 minutes after. So let's not read the whole thing, but I'll just again recap what happened there and give you the end and give away the ending. So the Gibeonites are one of the cities, or inhabitants of one of the cities in the land of Canaan. Joshua is supposed to conquer them. He's not supposed to make deals with them. But these guys are clever. They dress themselves up as if they came from a long ways away to kind of, make an appearance that they're not local. And they say, hey, Joshua, let's be buddies. Let's make a deal. Let's make a covenant. And in this covenant, Joshua was acting as a suzerain. He was acting as the big guy. They came and offered to be, hey, you want to be our protector. We want you to be our protector. We want you to be our overlord. And Joshua and the rest of the elders of Israel, thinking that these guys came from a long ways away, they said, all right, that's fine. We'll do that. So they cut a deal. These guys go away, and then eventually, they very quickly actually they find out that these guys are actually local, and they shouldn't have made a deal with them. But actually, how it happened was the other Canaanite cities, who apparently had a parity treaty. Morning, sir. Other Canaanite cities who apparently had a parity treaty with the Gibeonites were starting to get upset that the Gibeonites made a covenant with someone else. All right, and they were actually going to attack the Gibeonites, and then the Gibeonites called Joshua and said, "Hey, dude, we have a covenant, we have a treaty, we have an agreement, and you need to come and give us a hand." And that's when it becomes obvious that what happened. So now you would think that in this situation, because the covenant was made under false pretenses, Joshua would say, forget the covenant, right? It was a lie, so let's go and clean these guys out. But he doesn't. Covenant is taken that seriously that Joshua says, yeah, even though it was taken under false pretenses, we have to stick to the covenant. We promise we're not going to wipe them out. We're not going to wipe them out. We're going to make their lives miserable eventually, but we're not going to break our covenant. It was a sacred thing. It was considered extremely important. So, establishing a covenant, we're on page 2 by the way, establishing a covenant was a ritual that always involved animal sacrifice. So the phrase was to cut a covenant. It kind of became idiomatic, kind of like it was so common that, and actually a fun fact, there was one of these Middle Eastern states, you'll see on the next page, called Mari. Over there, the appropriate animal was a donkey. So in Mari, apparently the phrase was, let's cut a donkey. Yeah.
I remember, I forget who the covenant was, but God made a covenant and they cut birds in half.
We're gonna read that. We're gonna read
Okay.
that. Yeah, we're gonna get to that. Well, actually, it's just coming up right next.
Was it Joshua?
No,
Okay.
it was Abraham. So
Yeah.
the purpose of this, but why cutting animals? The purpose of this was to demonstrate what would happen to the party that breaks the covenant. There was a visual aid, and the lesser party would frequently walk in the blood between the cut animals, declaring their oath. During the ritual, blessings would be declared for the faithfulness and curses for the breaking of the covenant. So this was actually a bit of a grim scenario, where you're kind of doing this theatrical promise that whatever happens to this animal is really foreshadow what's going to happen to me if I don't stick to my part of the deal. And actually I have, if I can pull it up real quick, I have a quick quote from one of the other Middle Eastern covenants that was cut between the Assyrians and one of the small cities. I think it was Arpad. Just give this thing a quick second. But yeah, that was the basic idea behind it. I think it's over here. All right. So this was the from this treaty, from the covenant made between Assyria and a fellow named Mati'ilu, who was the king of the city of Arpad. So it says, they're cutting the lamb and they're saying, this head is not the head of the spring lamb, it is the head of Matilu, and it is the head of his sons, his magnates, and the people of his land. If Matilu should sin against this treaty, so may, just as the head of the spring lamb is cut off, the head of Matilu be cut off, and his sons be thrown into, and then there's, text is missing, this shoulder is not the shoulder of a spring lamb, it is the shoulder of Matilu, and so on and so forth. You get the picture. So it was a very graphic way of cutting a covenant, something that was supposed to kind of keep it very fresh in your memory. You do not mess with this. If you're in the big guy, little guy covenant, you do not want to mess with the big guy.
So obviously, the innocent blood was required to pay for sin.
There is that.
Was the innocent blood, was that part of the covenant of that sacrifice as well?
It comes in. It ties in together. Both of them. I'm glad you bring that up. Yeah, both those concepts actually tie in together. Right now, what we're discussing more is the fact that these covenants were a super common thing in the environment of ancient Israel. It wasn't something that was just came from the sky, no pun intended. It was something that was a very serious business and a very commonly understood business. Kind of like if I say, hey Larry, I have a contract with you. You know what that means, right? If you don't live up to your contract, I can take you to court.
Sure.
Right. So back then, if this was a common thing, we have a covenant. You know what that implies. That depending on what kind of covenant we have. So with having read all of this, let's read the story you just mentioned, which is the story of Abraham, and I'll take a volunteer to read this passage.
Can I ask you a question?
Yes.
Okay, he commented on the sacrifice, but the sacrifice and the covenant aren't the same.
They're not the same, but they function together, though. Sacrifices are established as part of the covenant, if that makes sense. Sacrifices are what happens within the covenant. They're intertwined. I mean, they're not the same. Like if you're making, I guess maybe if you're thinking about the covenant we mentioned earlier between Laban and Jacob, for example, where Laban was going to give his daughter to Jacob for a certain number of years. We know how that story went, but there was no. I don't think, off the top of my head, I don't remember there having been an animal sacrifice to seal that deal. But these covenants were kind of a life and death thing, and that's where you bring animals kind of to seal that out. My point being is that sacrifice and covenant are not one and the same, but they function very closely together in the Bible. covenants.
Is it like the signature?
Basically, yes, it
It's like
functions.
you have the contract and then you have the signature.
That's right, exactly. So cutting an animal was your signature. And then after that, they would actually have a party and roast the animal and so on and so forth. So it wasn't all grim business. It was actually also somewhat celebratory. With that being said, who wants to read the?
I'll read it.
Thank you.
And God said to Abraham, I am the Lord who brought you out from Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land to possess. But he said, O Lord God, how am I to know that I shall possess it? And he said to him, bring me a heifer, 3 years old, a female goat, 3 years old, a ram 3 years old, a turtle dove, and a young pigeon. And he brought him all these, cut them in half, and laid each half over against the other. But he did not cut the birds in half, and when the birds of prey came down on the carcasses, Abram drove them away. When the sun had gone down and it was dark, behold, a smoking fire pot and a flaming torch passed between these pieces. On that day, the Lord made a covenant with Abram, saying, to your offspring I give this land, from the river of Egypt to the great river, the river Euphrates.
All right. So now that we understand this cultural background of what's going on, let's think about what happened with Abraham here. So Abraham has this promise, but God gave him. We read that in Genesis 12. Abraham, or back then Abram, he goes out, listens to God, leaves the ancestral land, keeps migrating, but the promises of having offspring and everything else that comes with it are becoming kind of evasive because Abraham is darn old and he doesn't know what is going on and how this is going to happen. So Abraham actually does something pretty darn daring. He actually, and I bolded it here, he says, "Oh Lord, how am I to know that I shall possess it?"
Right.
Like, what's going to happen? And God's answer is not, "Well, just trust me, man. Okay, I'm God. I know what I'm doing, dude. Just,
Right.
settle down, man. Come on." No, what God does is he says, "Bring me a heifer and a goat," and so on and so forth. Abraham knows what's going on there. It's a weird answer. If you don't know this cultural background, this is a really weird answer from God, actually.
Yeah.
So Abraham knows what's going to happen, and so he gets the animals. He probably finds a nice rocky crevice where he can put them, cut them up and put them side by side. And he knows that a covenant's about to happen. But what Abraham is expecting that is going to happen is that Abraham himself is going to walk through the cut animals, because he's the lesser party.
Right.
It's the lesser party that walks through
Gotcha.
the cut animals. But what happens here instead?
God did it.
God walks. And this is the foreshadowing of the sacrifice of Christ.
Interesting.
It is
That's
really
very
powerful,
interesting.
actually.
That's very powerful,
If you understand that
He
God
basically lowered himself.
yes.
Just like Jesus did.
Just like Jesus did, right. Yeah, if there's a breakage of the covenant, who gets to pay the penalty? God is the one who made a promise that he will pay the penalty. It is really crazy to think about that this was written in the book of Genesis, that the work of Christ was so strongly foreshadowed. But if we don't know this covenant cultural background, then we kind of miss out. And quite frankly, to be honest with you, until I had put this together in the context of covenant making, this whole Abraham story was just a weird story. It maybe basically was like, well, Abraham asked God and God did something miraculous, So that's kind of was the level of it. I mean, it is miraculous, in a strict sense.
It's even more miraculous.
But it's even more miraculous when you understand what Abraham was expecting to happen and what actually happened. It was upside down from his cultural expectations.
I think it's cool too that, you think of God, he could have just said, my word's enough.
Exactly.
But he understood the culture. He understood what it would mean, and he was working in that culture. And I just think of today, God is still working in that culture, and
Yes.
just that it's cool because it means so much more once you understand that.
Absolutely, and that gives us some liberty that needs to be used very prudently to use our own cultural symbols to convey some of these truths. So yeah, we don't live in this culture, we don't have covenants of this type, but there are other relationships in our culture that we can use as a metaphor or as a way to illustrate something. So that's again something that needs to be used prudently, because we can get really crazy and have movie-based sermons. We don't want to be there, but you can, I've seen that happen too. Where they would just play the latest movie and that they would try to kind of, and I'm not against the idea completely. You can use some well-known references to kind of bring some points across, but don't get lost in that way of thinking and kind of make it an entertainment thing rather than proclaiming the gospel. All right, so the second definition we have of what a covenant is a bond in blood sovereignly administered. And this is me citing Ligon Duncan, who cites his Professor Roberts. So anyway, it's a covenant, it's a bond in blood sovereignly administered. So remember, Abraham doesn't come to this saying, hey, God, let's make a deal. Abraham doesn't really have anything to offer. He's not stupid. He knows who he's dealing with. He knows he's dealing with God Almighty, the creator of heaven and earth. He knows he's got nothing to offer here. So God is the one who steps out to make a deal with Abraham and the one who backs it up. The one who puts down the collateral, if you will. All right, that's a modern reference. So anyhow, as I said, let's move on to the next page. Archaeology has shown that covenant making was extremely common, an extremely common occurrence in the Middle East during biblical times. Well, all nations in the area, big and small, Egypt, Assyria, Canaanite, city-states, etc., participated in this practice. The most important example outside of the Bible comes from the Hittite Empire. And there's a little picture and a little arrow that I put there to help you locate it. The Hittite Empire is the most important empire you've never heard of. It took the modern culture a long time to catch up with the fact that they even existed. Actually, in the 19th century, they were used as one of the clubs to beat the Bible people with, because the 19th century was a golden age of skepticism in liberal Protestantism, and the approach was to doubt the Bible rather than to trust it. And this was one of the things that was brought up. The Bible mentions these people called the Hittites, and they don't exist. We haven't found any archaeological evidence that they have ever existed, so this is one of the things that the Bible says, and they're wrong. Well, they were wrong, and everyone was actually up for a huge surprise. Now, they're mentioned in the Bible. The Hittites are mentioned in the Bible. However, you never really get the impression that they're a superpower. They're mentioned as one of kind of the local guys. However, once everything was unearthed, it turned out that, yeah, they probably had a little presence, like a marginal presence where the Israelites were, and maybe that's why they're only mentioned kind of on the side. But they actually had a pretty darn impressive and advanced kingdom in what is now Turkey, Asia Minor. This was all uncovered I believe in the 20th century for the first time. The early 20th century took forever to actually then dig stuff up, decipher their writing, read through their archives, and so on and so forth. At one point in time, actually, they were speculating that the Hittites might have been the first one to use iron. They don't think that anymore, but nonetheless, they were a really important dude. But for us, what's really important is this covenant making. It turns out the Hittite Archives had a lot of covenants in them, and it looked like all of them basically followed the same structure. Like they were all put together in a pretty predictable way. And an important thing is also that the Hittites were operating in the middle of the second millennium before Christ. I'll explain later why. But anyway, so the Hittite suzerain vassal treaty, where the Hittites came in as the big guy and they were making covenants with the little guys, it basically breaks down like this, like I have it down here. So there's a preamble that introduces. There's the historical prologue, which is pretty important. Then there's the stipulations. There's the deposition and the provision that this covenant is read out loud in front of everyone. So, don't forget what we did here,
Did you say 2 millenniums before Christ?
The second millennium before Christ. Yeah, about 1,400 years,
Okay.
1,400 years before Christ, the time of Christ. So, and then there's a list of witnesses. Now, in the Hittite treaties, the list of witnesses were incredibly long. They were polytheists, believed in many gods, so they would list like all of their gods, and then they would, there was like a list of hundreds of witnesses. And in the end, there are curses and blessings. Right? So like I said, this stuff was only uncovered in the 20th century. And then in the middle of the 20th century, as some scholars were reading this, one person came to a very genius realization that, oh my goodness, the covenant in the book of Exodus and Deuteronomy are structured exactly like a Hittite treaty. They have the same elements. So this made things amazing because another big argument against the veracity of the Bible used to be that Moses could not have written the books that are attributed to him. The claim was that people in Israel back then would have been illiterate, and the claim was also that all the books of Moses were really written during the Babylonian exile. They were really like 1,000 years after they actually claim, and Moses had nothing to do with that. All this stuff was bogus. It was made up later on when the Jews were in the Babylonian exile. That was a theory for a very long time. It still actually has some proponents nowadays. However, if you realize that the Hittite treaty, which the Hittites in the second millennium, that was also the time of Moses. That was also so if Moses is copying or using a well-known format, that's a darn good indicator that Moses was indeed operating in this time. Another reason why this is important is because after the Hittites, the next big empire that did treaties was Assyria. And they had their own way of doing covenants, and it wasn't the same. They had a different way of doing it. So Assyrians were a lot closer to that later time. So you think if the Jews were indeed actually copying things from later times, or creating this in a later time, they wouldn't have had this cultural reference of something that happened 1,000 years before that. I know this is kind of convoluted, but to me, this is a really, really good, another good evidence for the veracity of the Bible that not only tells you that Moses could have written this in the time period that he did, it also tells you that it really makes no sense for him to have written it in any other time period in history. This was the common currency of the time, and that's what God does. He takes the children of Israel from from Egypt, right? He takes the children of Israel from Egypt. I just got to make sure what time. Oh, okay, I got plenty of time. So let's look at some of these elements on the last page and see how they correspond. So the preamble and the historical prologue are actually close together. They're kind of in one sentence. I am the Lord your God. So that's who is doing it. That's the preamble. Who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. So it gives their history together, and that's something that the Hittites did a lot as well. They would actually try to create their covenants not on fear, not on aggressiveness, not on intimidation. They would actually try to bring in a good history. Positive things. Yeah, positive reinforcements that, hey, we've had a good history. We've fought together. We traded together. You know,
We helped you here.
We helped you here, right? Like, unlike the Assyrians later on, who totally didn't have this section. Theirs was brute force. You're going to do this, otherwise we're going to wipe you out. I mean, theirs was,
There's no choice.
No choice. They were an extremely brutal culture. The Hittites were actually trying to do some positive reinforcement. They were trying to actually be sensible about this. And we have this same thing that God is giving to Moses. Says, I brought you out of the land of Egypt. So that's for the people of Israel to always remember how they came into a relationship with this God.
Right.
He brought them out of the land of Egypt. Stipulations and obligations. You shall have no other gods before me. So this is now the 10 Commandments. All right, so that's the bulk of the law. That's the stipulations. This is what you guys are going to do. This is what you guys are not going to do. So on and so forth. And then the deposition and the provision for a periodic reading before the people. The deposition, where is it supposed to be? It was supposed to be kept in the ark, right? And when was it supposed to be read? Every 7 years, according to the book of Exodus. The Israelites were supposed to come together for like a communal event, and everyone was supposed to hear the law being read out loud. There's a list of witnesses. Now, granted, the Bible professes and reveals one God. So unlike the neighboring treaties, we don't have a long list of divinities, God of the sun and the God of the harvest and the God of this. What God does is call heaven and earth to testify against you, which I find really interesting. And the way I connect it personally is that when and if you break the covenant, you're going to feel the consequences, whether it is in the drought or in the earthquake or whatever. It is the creation itself that God is going to use to punish the people who break His covenant. That's just my little spin on it. Curses and blessings. And we have curses and blessings in the book of Deuteronomy and the book of Exodus. So all these blessings should come upon you and overtake you if you obey the voice of the Lord your God. And actually you can see there's actually a whole section in Deuteronomy 27 and 28. And finally, there's a ratification of the covenant with an animal sacrifice in Exodus 24, 5 through 8. All right, we don't really need to read the text. We kind of can already see what happened if we don't know what, we're guessing what probably happened. At once, all of this was read in front of the people of Israel. There was a sacrifice. All right. And that's where Ron's question comes in about the sacrifice. It ties in together. Okay, it's used to seal the covenant, but it is also used, as it was said, for the forgiveness, to symbolize forgiveness of sins. So you kind of have two things being molded together and used as one big, powerful symbol. You're taking two separate concepts and you're putting them together to create a very graphic and powerful message that the people of the time would understand. So Exodus, there's animal sacrifice, and this was the crucial moment in history. This is when a ragtag of former slaves was made into a nation. This was that tectonic shift. Okay, they were just a people trying to survive essentially up until that point, or when they were enslaved in Egypt. They really had no concept of self-identity in a positive sense, only a concept of self-identity as being the lowest of the low in that particular society. Now, they've actually created a covenant with God Almighty that created them into a nation and promised them land to actually make this a physical reality and not just an idea. What we see here then in the New Testament, as we jump into Matthew, in the book of Matthew, we see a ratification of the new covenant. All right, so let's open our Bibles if anyone's got their Bible. All of you have your Bibles, by the way. I know all of you have Bibles, but and just read that short passage out of Matthew 27 or 26, 27 through 20. Shane, you want to give it a go?
26, what is it?
27 and 28.
26, 27, 28. Then he took the cup, gave thanks, and offered it to them, saying, "Drink from it, all of you. This is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins."
So these words echo what Moses said in the book of Exodus. He said, "Behold, the blood of the covenant." Jesus says, "This is my blood of the covenant." Now, you have to understand that for the disciples who have heard these words from the book of Exodus read out in the synagogue many times over the years as they were growing up, they couldn't miss what that actually means. We talked about this. There's these trigger phrases that every culture has. Like, if I say "we the people," everyone in this room knows what "we the people" refers to, right? If I say 9/11, everyone knows what 9/11 refers to. So when he says blood of the covenant, that immediately brings back the memory of that was the moment when the people of Israel actually became a people. When they actually established a covenant with God. So now we know that what's happening right now is something that is also of a monumental tectonic importance. It's a shift that's happening. It is not just a small symbolic gesture. It is a symbolic gesture, but it represents something enormous. So this morning, as we're taking communion, keep all these things in mind, because we had communion, I think, this morning. Keep all these things in mind. I think personally that makes a lot of this a lot more meaningful.
Yeah, the very next verse, I tell you, I do not drink from this fruit of the vine from now on until the day when I drink it new with you in my Father's kingdom.
Amen. So now that we understand covenant, it wasn't just a contract in a modern sense, or a contract in agreement in a modern sense. It went deeper. It was something hugely cultural and serious. Like we said today, with contracts, there can be serious consequences, but there is no contract that you can break that's going to result in you actually losing your head, right? I mean, you might lose your business, you might lose your, which is...
At least at the moment.
Right. Fair enough. But for that time and that place, it was a social reality that this is something that is a matter of life and death. It is really important. So the covenant of Christ isn't just a pinky promise. It's not even a signed contract, it's a lot more than that. And that's where we see that God, who promised Abraham in Genesis 15 that he will pick up the tab if the covenant is broken, we see him doing it on the cross.
Well, it also goes into even the quality of the animals sacrificed. They had
Oh,
to be
yeah.
blameless and
Yes.
spotless and everything, and then
The
that
best.
ties in also to Christ being blameless and
Right.
spotless.
They foreshadow the work of God. And yeah, that was the book of Micah, right, where they're criticized about bringing the lame. And that's, it's not about the legalism of bringing the best. It is about you understanding what it symbolizes.
Yes.
Because if you start bringing the lame and the bad, that means you have no appreciation for what's going on there.
Right.
That
It's a
means
hard issue.
yeah, it's a hard issue. It's a hard issue. It's not that God needs your best heifer or your best sheep
It's
or
like
whatever.
what you're saying is this covenant is more important to me than all of the best.
Exactly. Yes.
Yeah.
This is my
all
priority.
Of this good stuff. This is more important.
The covenant is more important. Is more important to me. So an important implication after we've read all this is that there is no such thing as unconditional covenant. All right. Covenant always requires this faithfulness called hesed, or hesed if I'm pronouncing it right, which was supposed to convey faithfulness laden with emotion. Like, okay, it's not faithfulness just as a mechanical thing. It's actually a faithfulness, a heartfelt faithfulness. And that's why in our Bibles, very often the word is translated as loving kindness, love, mercy. It's a bit of a struggle for translators to come up with the best translation for some of these words that had multiple meanings baked into them. You kind of have to pick one and go with it, and sometimes you try your best. But that word, that when you see loving kindness and faithfulness in the Old Testament, refers to this covenant relationship. And that is important because, again, going back to that extreme dispensationalism that I talked about in the beginning of the class, where it says that you don't need to follow Christ, essentially. It just says all you need to do is mentally assent and believe that God exists and He revealed Himself and Christ is the sacrifice, and that's all you need to do. You don't need to obey anything that Christ did, which, like Larry says, goes right against from what Jesus said, teaching them to obey everything that I taught. Right? So there is no such thing as an unconditional covenant. We don't bring anything into the covenant as an equal party. We are expected to follow the obligations of the covenant, and that's what it is. So.
I always say, I don't know